Welcome to episode 7 of the In Between Classes podcast. I'm your host, Will Golub, joined as always by my friend Josh Schmidt. Josh, how's it going?
So I actually re-entered the world of educational Twitter this week, and it seems like every time I do that, I wonder why I stopped using it in the first place. But one of the things that always comes up when I'm on Twitter is the value of quote-unquote real-world learning, and I think that's a perfect segue into our topic today.
Yep, and that was something we mentioned a couple weeks ago. We really wanted to spend an episode just talking about story problems, just because obviously in mathematics that is such a huge part of it, and both of us have a lot of, I don't know if opinions is the right way of putting it, but we have a lot of insight. Josh obviously from more experience than me, and then me coming straight out of college, we did a lot of talking about these in some of our methods classes. So when it comes to story problems, we definitely are very interested and wanted to talk about those. So Josh, I know you said you want to mention a misconception that you think the world has about story problems. So I feel like that'd be a great place to start this episode.
So I think the big misconception is when people think about story problems, they always think a textbook style story problem. Something where there are one or two sentences about the topic, and then there is a question at the end where all of the information in the story problem is relevant to what you're looking for. So if we're talking about proportion problem, you could do a classic, a person is this tall and they cast a shadow that's this long. A nearby tree casts a shadow that's 10 feet. How tall is the tree? Every bit of that information is relevant, it's important, and it's necessary to solve that story problem. And one of the things that I've attacked in my career is how can we change those story problems into something that's more inherently interesting and something that's more real world. So what I've done is I've done a few things. So the first one is I take those simple problems, like I had that shadow problem, and I turn it into a project. So the shadow problem becomes the shadow project, where kids physically just go outside and we measure our shadow, and we measure our height, and we measure the shadows of tall objects to figure out their height. It's immediately the same quality of content, if not better, but now there's more unnecessary information. There's also questions about, like, what about slants on a hill, or what if it takes an hour and the sun's location slightly changes? Much, much higher quality problems. There's also basic... Oh, go ahead.
So you're saying just by the fact of instead of here's all the information to find the height of a tree, you're going to tell the kids, okay, we're actually going to go outside and measure all this information. So instead of being given everything, just finding it yourselves makes it that much more interesting, that much more, lasting. You think they understand and will retain the information better if they're actually out physically measuring their heights, their shadow heights, the shadow of a tree, and then, do the math to figure out the height of the tree. You think that is obviously so much better than just reading a story problem and doing it.
I do think it's strictly better. It's more interesting. It's more engaging. I love taking the kids out of the classroom, but it has to be for something that's rigorous and applicable. But just simply doing the project is not necessarily going to create more retention. I think the other thing that you can do is you tie that problem back in the future and you use it other places. So the shadow problem gives us the shadow project, which covers proportions. Then you can use the information in proportions to do other valuable projects. Things like creating your dream house or creating a robotic hand with cardboard and string and stuff like that. And using those projects to then do something that is more valuable and more interesting. You also then can go back into a traditional style story problem, but you can include the information that you just did in the project. Like now when you talk about measuring the height, use a kid's name in your own problem and say, this child went outside and measured their shadow and they were this tall. They walked over to a nearby tree and it was this long. I guarantee you the kids are going to do better on that problem than they would be doing otherwise because it's applicable to them. You immediately win the argument of when am I going to use this in the real world, because we're going to go outside and we're actually going to go do this in the real world. And the third thing is it is applicable to them because they physically did it. You stop that problem of reading a book about somebody else. Like they are the ones that are involved.
So it sounds like you're saying just by strictly having more, and obviously this is a fair, obvious assessment in education in general, but just by engaging the students more, you don't need to have more rigorous work, but just simply having them being more engaged with it,
Yeah,
they
yeah.
will have better retention.
Most of the time, I do think like once you have engagement, I think you should use that to create more rigor. There's also the situation of if you take a real world problem right out of a textbook and you do some type of project with it, that's really valuable and interesting on its own, but you have to be super careful about what you do with that rigor. Like real world math is almost always easier than classroom math. You have because you're allowed to round and you're allowed to estimate the way that you aren't in a classroom. But you can create a more rigorous problem with the engagement that you earned from doing something that's more interesting. But it's the responsibility of the teacher to use that to their advantage.
Right, right. So it sounds like, yeah, you're saying get the engagement first and then you can create more rigor as opposed to I'm just going to throw a rigorous story problem that even if you create it yourself, but it's just a rigorous story problem on a piece of paper, go do this, it still won't have quite the value, it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, and if you can get engagement, you could teach anything. Like
Right,
that's
right.
the key. So this you can kind of kill two birds with one stone. You get the engagement, you get the rigor, you can do it together. But
And
you were
that
telling,
sounds
oh, yeah, you were
well,
telling
yeah.
me about a book that you read in your college class about
Yeah,
some stuff with like practices of mathematical story problems. You want to talk about that?
right. Actually, yeah, your idea of getting that engagement rolls right into this because it was a book we had to read for one of my math ed courses. It's called Five Practices for Implementing Mathematical Discussion, which is just a long way of saying how to get students engaged in the classroom. Which again, like I said, was exactly what we were talking about. But it basically just goes through the different steps that the teacher has to take in order to create engaged students that actually understand what a story problem in the math classroom looks like. And I guess I'll just kind of run through some of these steps. First one is, as a teacher, you have to anticipate what the students are going to say. You have to be ready for whatever they might throw at you in the classroom, whether that be, okay, I give them the information for a problem, they get to go work on it. You have to be ready for whether they have no clue what to do with it. It's like, throwing a kid a toy. If they have no idea how to play with it, then they're just going to sit there staring at you like, oh my, what am I supposed to do with this? So you have to anticipate how to get the students going with the problem in general, whether that's, saying, here's how we're going to set it up. Now you guys work with it from there, things like that. Then after they mentioned, so you got to be prepared, you have to anticipate. Next one would be to monitor what the students are doing. That's actually, in theory, in a classroom, that would be walking around, watching the students, how they're engaging with each other with the project, whether that's in individual groups, things like that. But by monitoring what the kids are doing, that leads to the next idea of, picking which students are implementing the different practices that you want to teach the whole class. So, you mentioned one time about your train problem where, you could have the students judge, you have two trains leaving a station, when are they going to meet? So it'd be, okay, one set of students might be creating a table to figure that out. Other students might be, drawing on coordinate plane the different equations of lines. So the idea is you want to select which students you want to show to the entire class. That way they can help teach each other. That way it's just not the teacher teaching the class the entire time. And then the last couple were just making sure you set those students up in the correct order. Say, okay, I want the students that are teaching this problem with a table to go first. That way I can introduce how to create an equation of a line or a line graph out of a table. Then after, a kid talks about table, have those next students come in that, actually drew out the line graph and things of that nature. Then the last part about it was just connecting what the students actually did and taught each other back to the actual mathematical concept that you're talking about for that day. So I know I just ran through, I just summarized the entire book in about a minute 30 there, but that was essentially the big way that I plan to implement story problems into my classroom. And I just thought that book was really fascinating and I thought worked well with what we were doing here.
Well, and I think when you talked about it, a couple things that really jumped out at me are number one, you have to be thinking about these story problems as a tool for your classroom. This isn't just something you provide kids at the end of a textbook assignment. This is something you're actually going to be doing together. And, it's not that hard to start your class with something that's interesting and engaging from your life. It doesn't need to be this giant project that takes 4 days. When I moved to Maine, I took a picture of myself on the first day that I left. I put a map on the board of the route that I took from South Dakota to Maine, and then I just had the question that said, how many gallons of gas did it take for me to get there, and how much did it cost? And the kids still bring up that just little stuff like that really mattered, and obviously they cared too much that my cat was in the picture, but they remembered it, and I can use that to do something else. I think something that you talked about that I love is the anticipation component. As a teacher, when you're creating your activity, write down the questions you expect to have, because you can start to predict where kids are going to get stuck and what questions they're going to have. Write down the question and plan out your answer. You can't predict everything, but it's going to save you time and energy, and then you're probably going to have a better answer for those kids in the end too. So just predicting the questions, writing down the questions and the answers for them is going to be really helpful.
Right. Yeah. No, that was, like I said, that was something that they really did emphasize. I mean, that should be in every, job, not just education. You should sit there and anticipate what you're going to be seeing in your job to do well at it. I mean, that's scouting in sports. That's how you get prepared for a basketball game, is you scout the other team and anticipate what you're going to see. So yes, in general, that is just a good concept that I think people overlook a lot. So the next thing we wanted to roll into is talking about when to implement story problems. You kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. Do you want to use it at the beginning of a unit to, like you said, use it at the beginning of a proportions unit, use your shadow project to introduce to the kids what they're doing? A lot of people I know have saved them for the end of units when it's like a big project. Okay, now that we've learned all this material on proportions, here's a giant project, story problem type thing for it. So I guess what are your thoughts? When is the best time to implement story problems into a unit?
The short answer, I think, is as often as physically possible. And if it would be possible for me to start every unit with a good project and end every unit with a good project and use the projects to create story problems, I would. There are some topics that are a lot harder to do that. Negative exponents jumps to the front of my mind. Other than scientific notation, I really struggle to come up with real world engaging story problems for that topic. And you and I have talked about this for years, is if you do not have a good story problem, shoehorning a story problem is super transparent, and the kids are going to see through it. Every textbook has had those fake real-world applications. The kids do not engage with those, and they're going to use that as an argument for later when you give them actual real-world problems. So I think the more often you can use actual real-world applications, the more you're going to be able to use it later with your students. What about how often do you think we should be using story problems? Should it be every day? Should it be every other day? Should it be infrequently? What do you think?
I think it really, and again, this is going to sound bad. I just don't want to echo everything you're saying here, but I agree with you in the aspect of, I think you really just use it when it's applicable. I mean, again, you don't want to shoehorn a problem in there because it's inauthentic. But again, if you can find a good story problem for every different assessment, then, I mean, obviously that's the best, especially because, again, most textbooks, and I think we might get onto this a little bit later, seems like every single textbook you'll have a handful of exercises that, you'll find X and Y, things like that. But then at the very end, then you have a handful of story problems that are supposed to pertain to the exercises you're doing. So I think it'd be nice to see some story problems with everything you're assessing, just show kids that, yes, everything you're doing in mathematics does have a real world application. But again, to do it every day would be ideal, so long as it actually makes sense to do it. It would be my idea there.
And I think that I remember if you're in a traditional classroom, I remember doing textbook assignments basically every day, and the last 2 or 3 problems were these really hard comparatively to the rest of the problems, and then there were story problems on top of that. And most students would A, predict the story problem to be the hardest problem in the assignment, and B, they would probably guess or skip it. If it was possible, I want every assignment to have a story problem that's early, that has, some, easy application, but it's still pretty natural. And then mix some into the middle, some real world problems using some of the information. And then the end, you can really hit them with a hard, difficult real world application. But if we only do story problems that are harder than the rest of the assignment or, activity, or we only do story problems at the end of the assignment, we are creating a structure where the kids assume story problems are harder than the other mathematics that they do. And the reality is real-world mathematics is usually easier than the mathematics they're doing in the classroom, but we're creating a culture where kids think it's the opposite way around.
Well, yeah, and I agree with that because, again, I flat out had the other day a kid knew he was going to have a good enough grade on assignment, so he just flat out skipped the story problem just because, he didn't want to try on it. Mm-hmm. So when I seen you left it blank, obviously made him do it. I was like, I'm not grading this until you finish this. So anyway, I agree with that. However, I find the problem that students can understand the exercises because, we teach them how to do proportions, set this 5/8 is equal to x over 16. What is x? Things like that. They can find that very quickly. But then when it gets to story problems, it's not that the math is more difficult. I'm finding the situation where kids just don't understand how to apply the math, or they just don't understand. I want to say they just don't understand basic real life situations very well, but it almost feels like that. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Do you feel like the kids are having trouble with the math or having trouble with why the math applies in that situation?
I think there's a few different problems that could be happening. I think the first and foremost one is that if you're teaching through emulation, that I do this problem on the board, you follow the same structure, anytime you change the structure, you're going to hit a roadblock. So many times when I'm creating problems on the board, I try to create them in all of the special cases as often as possible so that my problems on the board are harder than the problems that the kids are going to do. I think it's really natural as a teacher because you're creating leveled content from the bottom up, that your first few examples are super easy. And then when you get to the independent work, they're harder than the work the kids have seen. So I think that's number one, is if you're teaching through emulation, anytime the structure changes, you have a problem. Number two is, we as teachers, and myself included, don't always do a great job of starting with the story. If the story problem is the real-world application right away, and then the strategy is the shortcut, you're far more likely for the kids to understand the structure. For example, with systems of equations, we start with 10 story problems that they have to solve through guessing and checking in tables. They take forever. And then by the end of the assignment, the kids are like, I know there's a shortcut. Can you show me the shortcut, please? And I'm like, I'm glad you asked, because now we're going to learn the graphing and substitution and addition methods. And then you're going to do the same assignment again in 3 weeks, and it's going to take you 20 minutes. And using the story problem right away to show them why they need the shortcut is really effective as well. The third thing is, we don't necessarily control reading ability. We don't control problem-solving ability. So if you're giving them a story problem, you add in all of this noise, statistically speaking, that could be knocking down your data. So even for me, I try to do journals every couple of weeks, and I try to make them write every answer in a complete sentence and little things like that, because I need them to be able to read and write effectively to do the real-world applications I'm going to give them. But if they don't know how to do that before they get to you, it is absolutely harder to do those types of applications.
Right, yeah, and I honestly feel like I'm seeing that right now, and I don't want to sit here and start blaming kids, younger teachers, because I feel like that's always every teacher's cop out. Oh, always, well, you were supposed. Yeah. So I'm going to avoid doing that right now. So with that in mind, might as well move into the final thing that we were interested in touching on today, and that was, how do we fix in quotation marks, traditional story problems. And this is kind of the concept of, I think you might have mentioned it earlier, you have 3 sentences worth of numbers. The boy is 5 feet tall, his shadow is 3 feet tall. There is a tree, we don't know how tall it is, its shadow is 30 feet tall. How tall is the tree? So that traditional story problem of, here are 3 sentences worth of information, you're going to need every bit of it. At the end, there's 1 sentence with a very specific answer that with that information. And that's what I guess you were calling a very traditional story problem, which has value in itself, but I don't think it really gets to the heart of what a true story problem is. And you have an idea about how, maybe not your original idea, but you've heard about ways to fix these traditional story problems. And, what were your thoughts on that?
Well, and I've definitely thought about this a lot over the course of my career, but a lot of the conversation started with Dan Meyer's TED Talk. And if you haven't seen it, you need to see it. It's incredible. In his TED Talk, he talks about the concept of giving too much structure in textbook style problems and how he views it as a missed opportunity. So no real world problem is going to give you step-by-step suggestions on what your next option is unless someone already solved the problem before you. So, for example, we have a 3D printer in my school, and I broke it, in like the first month, and I needed to fix it. And the kids saw me frustrated because I don't know how to fix this, and I have nobody to help me fix it. And so they watched me over the course of the day, like looking up YouTube videos and checking this other thing and talking to this person. And that was the best example I have to them of what real world learning actually looks like. Now I can fix that, with my eyes closed. Not really. But, you also never have real world problems that have one specific solution without other possibilities. There's that problem you were coming up with has an answer for the height of the tree. The real world application of that is far more complicated. You also never see real world problems that are written as these short 3-sentence descriptors with no useless information. You were actually telling me a problem that your student had that you thought it had some useless information in it, and it made you really excited.
Yeah, so I was helping a kid with a story problem the other day, and I didn't fully understand the problem myself. In our classroom, it's self-paced, I'm helping kids all over the map, and this was a student who just reached, one of the newer sections, so I hadn't reviewed this material as much. So, again, poor job on my part anticipating things. Doesn't matter the story. Anyway, so I'm helping this girl with this problem, and I'm reading through it, and I read the first couple of sentences, or by the time I get to the end, I was like, okay, I know how to solve this. I'm just going to reread it just so I make sure. And then I read the first couple of sentences. I was like, oh my God, I don't think they need this information. These kids, she's going to be baffled that they gave her information that she doesn't need. And I was like really excited to see the book for the first time give the students extraneous information. That way they have to sift through and find out what is important to them. Well, after I kept reading through, I was like, oh, no, never mind. That has a very specific purpose. We need that there. So, I don't know. It's sad when you get excited to see a story problem that you think is worded in a new and unique and, challenging fashion, but then it's just like every other one. It's, again, no extraneous information. Everything's listed according to how you need it and ask for, again, a very specific example. So, I don't know, I just thought that was a funny anecdote that, we felt would fit well here.
Well, and I have 2 ways that I try to fix that problem. The first one is going along with your story is if I find a story problem that has a really good starting point and I have the opportunity to improve it or fix it, I do. I try to make story problems that use kids' names in them. I give them completely ridiculous information in it. Recently, I created a story problem with a student's name. There was a charity event at my school where there was a video game, and the kids convinced me to play the video game against them. So in the story problem, I had defeated this student and the video game 50 consecutive times. And I go on to talk about how ashamed he was and how upset he was that he lost to a 31-year-old man. And all of this information's in there. And then at the end of the problem, it ends up talking about, the height of a slide and the angle of trajectory. So obviously the information there wasn't necessary to the problem. But the kids at some point were like, what in the world is going on in this problem? But I said, the funny part is you are going to remember that problem for the rest of the year. Like little stuff like that makes a big difference. Or I have some of my 7th graders, when I create story problems, I do daily quests, really short assignments for homework for them. And when I create story problems, they will ask me, when am I going to be in the next problem? And they love seeing their name in there, even if it has nothing to do with the context of the problem. So it adds a little bit of engagement, and then you can add some extraneous information. The other way is the thing that Dan Meyer is great at, is taking those story problems and changing them into visual or multimedia. So like creating a video that shows the problem. Things like that make a huge difference because in the video, there's tons of extraneous information.
No, yeah, and what you mentioned, the idea of including students in the problem, that's something, again, in one of my college classes, the professor made a point of doing that for every single assignment. And they would do the little funny thing where they would switch your first letter of your first name and first letter of your last name. So I'd find, Gil Watlub is doing this and that. And it just felt so incredibly childish because we're a bunch of 21, 22-year-old college students. And, we're this very, I don't want to say, it is just kind of childish thing of just seeing your name with the letters flipped around. But again, it still does create engagement. Like I said, I still remember that because of something very specific like that she did. And again, I don't think she was doing it for our sake. She was doing it for the sake of making a point of, hey, this is something that is actually really has tangible benefits that it would be a good practice to begin. So,
going along with that
before.
Well, and just going along with that, I actually had a problem in my real analysis class in college. I, kind of a weird soul once in a while, and I came up with the shortcut names for all of the theorems in the class. And my personal favorite was deuces. It was like 6.22 something. And I remember one of the questions on our final was literally prove theorem deuces. And I was just so pumped. And I literally stood up in my chair and clapped. I was so excited. And it was one of those moments that it's kind of childish, but you remember those moments. And if we can create those moments for kids, it does make a difference. And it doesn't take a ton of effort on our part to do it.
Yeah, and to the second point you talked about, the idea of Dan Meyer, including multimedia and things like that, creating a video of your story problem or this or that. I remember it was one of the videos, or actually this might have been Robert Kaplinski. Do you recognize that name?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I think it might have been his. He was doing a story problem with kids where they, read an article about a sinkhole in, I don't know, like Chile or something. I'm sure, yeah, you're shaking your head. It's one of those fairly familiar, story problems that teachers will throw in. But anyway, they start out by reading the article, and, the article said you needed something like 5,000, gallons of cement to fill this sinkhole or something like that. And then the kids went through and did the math on it, and it wasn't even close. It was something like in the hundreds of thousands or whatever would be the case. And, the teacher's sitting there just absolutely baffled, this Robert Kaplinski. And so he ends up emailing the, editor, whoever it was. And they're like, yeah, we didn't actually check our math. Turns out you guys are right. And we were completely. So, yeah, it's just the idea of including different mediums of, whether it's in an article or a video or something like that. Because then he ended up showing that article to the kids and yeah, I emailed this guy, and it turns out they were completely wrong and you guys were right. Just creating engagement in different ways, just another way to make story problems more engaging and more lasting with students, I think.
And one final thought on this. One of the things that I've started doing is when I go out and I see mathematics in the real world, I take pictures of it, and I try to bring those pictures back to class. The most recent example is my wife and I went to Acadia National Park, and we were taking a boat out to an island to go hiking. And on the boat, it had this emergency kit for rope if someone goes overboard. And they literally have the Pythagorean theorem on the boat talking about how long the rope needs to be. And I look like an idiot, crawling under the thing to get a good picture for my students. And my students were like, no, that's not real. It's legitimate. I saw it this weekend. This is a real thing. And I don't have to convince them where they're going to use that skill in the real world. Another one, the Pythagorean theorem, I used to teach in Salem when they were redoing the gym, and I drugged my class out to the redone portion, and I pointed to the wall where they had done all the Pythagorean theorem calculations for support beams, and I'm like, look at this. Like, I told you that they're using it out here. It's literal proof. And, the kids remember those moments. I don't need to convince them where it's going to be used in the real world. Like, I showed it to them myself.
Right. And again, that comes back to, the larger picture of why, educators, mathematics specifically, use story problems when they're teaching, because in the end it is just a more lasting, more realistic, application of the mathematics that they're learning. And that's, again, we might sound like geeks sitting here talking about story problems for 30 minutes, but it is such a crucial, we're such a crucial part of our careers that yes, it totally warranted a half-hour conversation. So I'm glad we had it.
I'm glad.
That being said, we're moving into our closing bell topic, and Josh, you had one this week. I'm excited to talk about. Hit us with your closing bell.
So, and I'm excited to talk to Will about this one too, because he and I feel very similar on this, and it's the topic of competition in teaching mathematics. So I was working with my math team, students this week at our final math meet of the year, and I watched how competition was incredibly beneficial for them. They put forth an incredible amount of effort. They worked well in groups on these incredibly hard problems, and I saw the benefits of their hard work as they were able to do these mathematical problems that, frankly, were harder than what I give them in class. However, later in the week, I'm reading articles that talk about the negatives of competitive timed games in math classrooms, especially things like around the world, where you have two students competing for the quickest answer and the winner moves on. So my question is, what are the times where competition is a net benefit versus the times when competition is a net negative in your classroom? So what do you think?
So when I think about stuff like that, I think again, this isn't a great answer, but I think it comes down to, it depends on the students. Because, in some cases, some students are motivated by competition, but other students, it's just not their thing. And again, I was in sports year round. So if I heard there was a competition, whether it be in math or, quiz bowl, things like that, it doesn't matter what it was. Like, I'm interested in it just for the fun of competition. So that's where, I think about in a paced classroom. This actually just happened the other day. So we have two students who are neck and neck, just about to finish the curriculum at near the same time, and they're in different class periods. And every day one of them's asking, oh, where's the other kid at? And you can tell the two of them are racing, trying to see who can be the first one to finish, which I like seeing it because those kids are motivated to do math. But at the end of the day, are they, because I could see myself doing that exact same thing, are they motivated to do the math, or are they just doing whatever they can to get by, to get it done with? So that's where it really depends on the students, whether they'll get anything out of it and whether competition is what motivates them. But that's, why it can be a little bit of a dangerous thing, whether they're actually learning the material you want them to.
Well, and I try to turn competition into, you're not necessarily competing with your class. Like, there is some of that with things like Kahoot. I love Kahoot. I love quizzes. I love Quizlet Live. But making sure that the actual assessments themselves are, you're competing with yourself. Like, that fits my educational philosophy, it fits the classroom. So I love using games, like game-based assessments, and that you're competing with the high score, or you're competing with beating your score from yesterday, which I think is really valuable. And I haven't done Jeopardy style review games in a few years, because I'm struggling with this belief that that's undercutting the message of learning at your own speed when it's a race or you're competing with the students in your classroom. I literally say learning is not a competitive sport on a daily basis. And then learning is not a competitive sport. By the way, we're doing Jeopardy today and the winning team gets, 10 Clipper tickets. Totally undercuts my message. So my gut feeling, and I want to hear what you think of this, is that if you can create the atmosphere as competing against yourself or competing against the high score, it might solve some of these problems with having to be learning better than the people in the class.
Right, and I agree with that. And again, to keep tying it back to sports, I was literally just talking to a student the other day and how he ran whatever it was as track meet, and he's like, "Oh man, yeah, there's another kid beat me by like 5-6 seconds," and me and the other teacher were like, "Track is not about. I mean, yes, obviously it's a competition. You want to beat the other person, but regular season track is all about beating your latest time. It's always about getting personal best, and that's where." Yes, if you can have games on, I again, I don't know all the games that you use, Manga High or whatever, all those are for assessments, games where they're creating a high score that they're competing against themselves where they want to beat their own score. I think that would definitely be ideal because then you're not, competing against another person. You're not, being put down just because you're not as quick at naming off, what's 8 times 8 in, around the world or things like that. So I agree. I think it has a place, games do, when it comes to just competing against yourself.
Well said.
And yeah, and again, I also don't want to, add to this, and this is a completely different tangent, this world of, we're getting rid of competition, everybody gets participation awards. I think that is not related to education and learning in a math classroom. It's the idea of, I don't want to create a game because I want somebody to feel like a winner and another person to feel like a loser. I don't want that in my classroom. No, that's not what I'm trying to get rid of. I still love competition.
I agree with you. Yeah, like I think it's just finding that balance of healthy competition and competing against yourself. Like I love the example of the track student. Like it's about personal best. It's not about the place that you ended the race.
Right. So, I don't know. Yeah, it's a tough one because again, games have been used in education, I'm sure, for years just to try and get better student engagement and make kids, want to learn this information. When at the end of the day, they aren't learning it because they want to learn the stuff. They're learning it because they want to win the game, and it's dangerous when you're using that as the carrot rather than actual learning.
Agreed.
Yeah. But with that in mind, thanks for joining us on this episode of the In Between Classes podcast. Josh, what do you think we're going to be talking about in the next couple weeks?
So over the last year, you've been working on your senior research project where you explored the positives and negatives of independent pacing in a variety of math classrooms. I, for one, am extremely excited to hear how that research turned out.
Yeah, that's something I was actually recently going to go to a research convention in Atlanta. Unfortunately, weather canceled that, but that's something we can get into a little bit more next week. But yeah, it's something that I worked really hard on over the last about year and a half, and I finished that up last December and just kind of been sitting on it, presenting at different research conventions for the last semester. So yes, that is something I'm very excited to share with Josh and share with anybody that listens to this podcast. So with that in mind, hope you'll join us in a couple of weeks.